Hello, sir.
All right, well, I'm David Elwood, the new Dean of the Kennedy School of Government, and I welcome all of you here. This is actually the first forum event of the year, and it's certainly highly topical and meaningful. On a more mundane note, let me ask that all of you turn off all your cell phones or turn them to vibrate or whatever else so that we can proceed with the discussion. We're obviously in the midst of an enormous struggle and challenge, and it's one that's unlike anything we've ever fought before. This past weekend, of course, we marked the third anniversary of actually the deadliest terrorist attack, one of the deadliest attacks, period, on U.S. soil. And some argue that, though some would argue that that war, in some ways, began years ago. 9/11 obviously cost thousands of lives, but Graham Allison here and others are here to frighten us with a much more serious scenario, one that could involve something far greater than an inferno in a building or whatever. It's obviously a nuclear weapon. President Bush calls it the ultimate nightmare, and he's pledged that, quote, "We will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes and terrorists to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons." Senator Kerry states the greatest single threat we face in the world today is a terrorist armed with nuclear weapons. And on the other hand, we have open borders, we have a bustling economy, we have busy ports, and experts tell us that this thing is, a nuclear weapon could be delivered quite easily in a variety of different ways. So the obvious question is, what can we do to prevent this? And to address this question, we do have this remarkable group, this remarkable panel. Now, actually, 3 members of this panel are deans or former deans of the Kennedy School. And actually, it's easy to tell kind of which ones are former or current. If the newest deans have like lots of pages in front of them, but later deans, like I noticed Graham's got a 3x5 note card that he's scribbling on even as we speak. So even now, moments before he begins, his talk is being written, and then Joe and I over here. I'll introduce them all. You'll notice he's recently a dean. Why do I need any paper? But I'd like to start with Graham, and obviously we turn to a very serious subject. Graham is currently the director of the Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And quite importantly, between 1977 and 1989, he served as dean of the Kennedy School. And indeed, this building, he's largely responsible for building it and much of what you see around you. He also served in the first Clinton term as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy and Plans, where he coordinated Department of Defense strategy and policy towards Russia, Ukraine, and other states in the Soviet Union. Those of you that are students here are likely to be subjected to Essence of Decision, explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis, which ranks among the best sellers in political science. I don't know quite what that means, but actually 350,000 copies are in print, which is really quite an extraordinary thing. And his most recent book, shown here on the screen and so forth, Nuclear Terrorism, The Ultimate Preventable Catastrophe, has been getting rave reviews. And so he's going to start out the discussion tonight with talking about 10 minutes. I think he's going to start by recounting the chilling story of Dragonfire. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Graham Allison.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David, and let me thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank David in particular as the new dean here for hosting such an event about a book which is actually a vehicle for trying to help bring into sharper focus an issue. And actually, before I tell the story of Dragonfire, which I begin with in the introduction of the book, let me just say a word of context. This book, Nuclear Terrorism, The Ultimate Preventable Catastrophe, was published just a month ago. It is actually the tip of an iceberg, the iceberg having been formed by more than a decade of investments at the Center for Science and International Affairs here at the Kennedy School by many of my colleagues, including John Holdren, Joe Nye, Matt Bunn, Ash Carter. Indeed, as we said today, if you went back to whatever the center was initially created to do by Paul Doty, back now more than 25 years ago, it was to try to address issues of nuclear danger. So there's no way in the world that this book would have been written or could have been written except that it was serving in effect as to stand up on the shoulders of lots of investments that had been made. And in that way, it's actually, for those of you who are new students here, illustrative of what the centers at the school do when they do well. I mean, David has been talking about the need for, or the question, or a big question for the school, ideas that have impact on important policy issues. And I think that the investments that Paul Doty and then generations of people at the center have made in trying to better understand nuclear danger is reflected in this book, which tries to address the current face of nuclear danger, namely nuclear terrorism, and to do so for ordinary citizens. I mean, it's written for somebody who might be running for Congress, let's say, who doesn't want to be a policy wonk expert on the subject, but wants to understand what both President Bush and what Senator Kerry say is the gravest threat facing America today. One other just quick footnote, in some of the publicity about this, from time to time the people say the founding dean of the Kennedy School. Let me make sure I correct this footnote. There were 3 distinguished deans of the Kennedy School before I got here. Most importantly, my predecessor, Don Price. I was I think Joe will sometimes say the building dean of the Kennedy School. That is, I was dean when we built all these buildings, but that was certainly correct. But I count myself fortunate to have been part of a family of deans, and the fact that there's 3 deans here make one a little bit worried, but nonetheless. So much for backdrop. 3 points quickly. First, the story. Second, the argument in a nutshell. And finally, a question. In the introduction, I start with the story of Dragonfire. 1 month after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center, George Tenet, at that time director of CIA, went into President Bush and said, a CIA agent, codenamed Dragonfire, reports that Al-Qaeda has a small nuclear weapon that would make a 10 kiloton explosion in New York City now. So there was a moment of silence, after which questions were asked, like, could this be real? Is this possible? Did the Soviet arsenal contain 10 kiloton weapons? Yes. Are all those weapons accounted for? Uncertain. Could Al-Qaeda have such a nuclear weapon? Yes. If Al-Qaeda had a nuclear weapon, could it have brought it into New York City without our otherwise knowing? Yes. So there was no basis in science or technology or politics on which to deny that this was a realistic threat. And indeed, that was the point at which Vice President Cheney evacuated Washington, because if there's a 10 kiloton weapon in New York, it could just as well be in DC, and stood up an alternate government, in effect, at the famous R site, which has subsequently been revealed to be on the Pennsylvania border, where there were people who would be a government of the US if, God forbid, a nuclear explosion should occur in Washington and that government should disappear. I married that to a second story in the introductory chapter of bin Laden's objectives for America. Several months later, after this Dragonfire incident, bin Laden's press spokesman, a fellow named Abu Ghaith, put up on their website Al-Qaeda's ambition, as he says, quote, to kill 4 million Americans, including 2 million children, and to cripple an equal number, close quote. Now, he doesn't pull this number out of thin air. He actually offers a fascinating, if macabre and grotesque, calculus about what would be required to balance the scales of justice for the deaths and injuries that what he calls the Jewish Christian crusaders, by whom he means Israel and the United States, have caused Muslims over a series of battles, which he takes back to the creation of the State of Israel in specific incidents. So he gives body counts of how many people he thinks dies at Jenin, or how many children were starved by the sanctions regime in Iraq. Now, how many, the Kennedy School is known for our mathematical precision. How many 9/11 attacks would it take to kill 4 million Americans? And the answer is about 1,400. So you're not going to get there by hijacking airplanes and crashing them into buildings. So that's two stories. The argument in a nutshell. This book has two parts, part one and part two. First part says inevitable. Second part says preventable. So in part one, I take you through the who could do it, bin Laden, but a bunch of others. What could they do it with? A nuclear bomb that was made or homemade. Where could they get it? Half dozen attractive sources. When could they have it? If they bought it yesterday, they have it today. If they bought material from which to make a bomb, they could make it within a year. And how could they get it here? To which the answer is, just let me count the ways. But I've got to follow the golf clubs. So you want to play golf here, you're coming from Jakarta, you call up a freight forwarder, they pick up your golf clubs, they deliver them at the golf course, and that's the end of that question. And we don't see anything along the way. Or follow the drugs. As another former dean of this school, Al Carnesale, often observed, you know, if you have any doubt about Al-Qaeda's ability to bring a nuclear weapon to Boston or New York, they could always wrap it in a bale of marijuana. Okay, so you get through part one, and the answer is inevitable on the current course. And the proposition is that if the US government just keeps doing what we're doing today, and the Russian government and the Pakistani government and others, just what we're doing today, a nuclear terrorist attack is inevitable, indeed I say, more likely than not in the decade ahead. And I think mostly when you finish part one, you would say, we're living on borrowed time. Indeed, it's remarkable that such an event hasn't happened already. And I think we should be thankful for that fact. That's the bad news. The good news, and the main message of this book is the good news, is that nuclear terrorism is preventable. And I think the point at which I believe that there's a both conceptual or analytic and even policy relevant analytic advance in the book is to recognize and to make persuasive the proposition this could actually be prevented. Now, how's that possible? Because there's a strategic narrow to this issue in which all we have to do is prevent terrorists acquiring highly enriched uranium or plutonium, the two fissile elements that are required for a nuclear bomb, in order to prevent nuclear terrorism. So I even have it as a little simple but happy syllogism. No fissile material, no fission explosion with the vast release of energy that produces a mushroom cloud, no nuclear terrorism. So fortunately, highly enriched uranium and plutonium don't occur in nature. Fortunately, they're extraordinarily difficult to make, requiring billions of dollars of investment over a decade and a serious, substantial enterprise. Indeed, Iran has been 18 years in this project and is just now coming to the finish line. So, in principle, we know how to address this issue, and I try to organize a response to it under a doctrine of three no's. No loose nukes, which would mean locking down all current nuclear material, all bombs, all highly enriched uranium, all plutonium, to a gold standard. The US loses no gold from Fort Knox, not an ounce. Russia loses no treasures from the Kremlin armory. So in principle, we know how to lock down things we don't want people to steal. And could you lock down nuclear weapons as good as gold? I'd say, why not? So second, no new nascent nukes, no new national production of highly enriched uranium or plutonium. Iran is the current test case. Iran stands today within months of completing its factories that will allow it to enrich uranium and reprocess plutonium. And if they get across that line, there's no further policeable border between them and nuclear weapons. So no to Iran, and I outline a strategy for, in effect, a grand bargain for denuclearizing Iran. Third and finally, no new nuclear weapon states. That's essentially no North Korea as a nuclear weapons state with a nuclear weapons production line. There's been a lot of work done here at the school, especially by our colleague Ash Carter on that topic, but I also outline a strategy for that. So in a nutshell, inevitable, preventable, and a strategy for prevention. My third and final point, just to conclude, is with a question. And it really is it's Bill Perry's question. Bill Perry was the Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration, as a professor at Stanford now, and co-chair with Ash of this preventive defense project. At the Aspen Strategy meeting this summer, of about 75 reasonably serious strategic thinkers, at least it included Joe and me. But Madeleine Albright and Bill Perry and Sam Nunn and other quite reasonable, credible folks. Bill Perry said the following. He said, this quote, "We are racing towards unprecedented catastrophe. There is no sense of urgency in the public. What in the world can we do to awaken the public and energize our government?" And I call this sort of Perry's Creed, and I think that's a question that we're still struggling with.
All right, thank you very much, Graham. Now I'd like to quickly introduce our other three panel members, and then the format will be I'll ask them, the panel, some questions to talk about, and then I'd like to turn to audience questions. So let me start here, the left just beyond Graham, John Holdren. He's the Teresa and John Hines Professor of Environmental Policy. He's also the director of the program on Science and Technology and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. He's chair of the Committee on International Security and Arms Control of the National Academy of Sciences. He was a member of President Clinton's Committee on Advisors on Science and Technology. He chaired studies for the White House on protection of nuclear bomb materials, the U.S. fusion energy R&D program, the energy R&D program for climate change. Obviously a terrific person to be giving us some thoughts about this. Please welcome John Holdren. Next we have Alex Jones. He's the Lawrence Lombard Lecturer on Press and Public Policy. He's also the director of the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. He covered the press for the New York Times from 1983 to 1992, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1987. In 1992, he left the Times to work on the book The Trust, The Private and Powerful Family Behind the New York Times, and it was a finalist in the National Books Critics Circle Award. He's been a Nieman Fellow at Harvard and is on the advisory board of the Columbia Journalism Review, International Center for Journalists, Committee of Concerned Journalists, Center for Strategic International Studies. Obviously someone that can help us think about how the word gets out, Alex Jones. Finally, Joseph Nye was from December 1995 through June 2004. He guided this fine institution and deserves credit for much of what you see here today. He's currently the Kennedy School Distinguished Service Professor and Sultan of Oman Professor. Prior to assuming the deanship, Joe served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, in which he won 2 Distinguished Service Medals and is chair of the National Intelligence Council. He originally joined the Harvard faculty in 1964 at the age of 2, serving as the Director for International Affairs and as Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences. And his latest book is Soft Power, The Means to Success in World Politics. Please welcome Joe Nye. So Joe, maybe I can start with you, and frame Graham's actual first question with a little bit of an expansion. There doesn't seem to be enough sense of urgency, says Graham, here in the United States, but one wonders about the sense of urgency worldwide, in fact. And so the question is it really possible to get the kind of international campaign, which is clearly necessary, starting here and more globally, to really deal with this challenge? And what would it take?
Well, first let me congratulate Graham on the book, because one of the things it takes is a raising of awareness, and I think Graham has done a terrific job on this. I call this his Paul Revere book. Let's hope it has his equally happy a solution. But it's also, I think, as a book extremely well written. It's something the public can grasp if you get these ideas across. And some of you may know I've written a novel called The Power Game, which is supposed to come out in a couple of months, which is a thriller about Pakistan transferring nuclear weapons to Iran. But all I can say is that whatever I wrote, it's nowhere near as thrilling as what's in Graham's book. So if we can get the public to pay attention to this, I think that's the first important step. With that said, and with all the applause and agreement with everything that's in Graham's book, if you had to ask me to bet the mortgage on my house, will he be able to pull off his 3 no's, it's pretty iffy. And there isn't the same sense of awareness. Well, there's not even enough awareness here, but there's certainly not in other countries. And just to give you an example, take on the second no, you have the case of Iran, no new nascent nukes. Graham has a very good scheme, which I agree with in there, which says, offer to the Iranians that we will provide them enriched uranium and take back the fuel for reprocessing, so they can have nuclear energy, but without developing enrichment capacity, which otherwise allows them to break out and make a bomb whenever they want. The current non-proliferation treaty allows that legally. So it would mean rewriting the rules of the game. And the question is, are we going to be able to get a consensus to do that, and will the Iranians go along with it? The Europeans are now working on this, but with only imperfect results. The Iranians have said they won't agree to give up this capacity in the long run. Temporary suspension is one thing, but not the long run. And they say, why should we give it up if others don't? And one of the things that's difficult, and it's not really mentioned in the book, is Brazil is also doing enrichment. We're not stopping the Brazilian enrichment plant. When we try to stop the Iranians, why aren't they going to say, what about the Brazilians? Or for that matter, what about the Israelis? We live in a dangerous region, along with the Israelis, and you get the Israelis to agree and we'll agree. In other words, if I ask the question, not what would I like to have happen, I'd like to have Graham's scenario come true, but what would I bet on? I'm not sure I'd bet positively on this coming out right. It's worth trying, but whether it'll come out right is still pretty iffy. And on the third no, which is the no nuclear weapon states, no new nuclear weapon states. Graham in the book talks about North Korea rushing to the nuclear threshold. Well, you can make a case, as somebody who supervised the National Intelligence Estimate on this in 1993, that they've already crossed the nuclear threshold. Indeed, they probably crossed it during the Bush 1 administration. And whether that's true or not, the question of whether you can really stop the North Koreans or reverse them, roll them back, is again a very difficult proposition. Graham's got a good proposal in the chapter on this. I would, if I could implement it myself, I would do it. But the question you asked me is not is it a good idea, not is it a worthy idea, but what would I bet on it? We now are in 6-power talks with the Japanese, Russians, South Koreans, North Koreans, so forth. We're trying to get the North Koreans to move in this direction. Not much sign of progress. Indeed, if you were a North Korean and had been called the part of an axis of evil, and you saw the Americans there looking to change your regime, why wouldn't you want a nuclear deterrent? And so if you ask me again, just as a betting proposition, is Graham's good plan going to work? Right now, I think it's pretty iffy.
But it seems extremely discouraging, and I guess my question to all of you is sort of why? Why doesn't, it's so stark. It seems to me Graham's arguments are very convincing, but they're there, they're out, people have been saying, why, is democracy just unable to take seriously this kind of threat until it happens, and then, of course, the world changes? I don't know, Alex, does the press have a role here that they're not?
Of course, the press has a huge role, and unfortunately, the precedents are not great. I mean, as you say, does something have to happen first? I would only remind you of the coverage of terrorism as a reality in America, and the way it was covered and the way it was apprehended by most people before 9/11 and after 9/11. I have a theory that if the United States had not dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that there probably would have been a nuclear war, because I think that there was a demonstration that prevented another nuclear war that would have had to somehow have happened for us to really understand it. And I'm sorry to say that I think that the likelihood of really seizing the imagination of the American public and the press is probably going to take some kind of vivid demonstration. Now, does that mean there are other elements to this argument, there are other elements to why the media does what it does, but the demonstration is the most powerful incentive to coverage. That's unfortunate, but the media is built to react rather than to anticipate.
John Holden, we hear about other kinds of threats as well, dirty bombs, nuclear power plants, and so forth. Are they an equally large threat, and are we doing equally little there?
No, they are not an equally large threat, but they're also by no means negligible. I think Graham is absolutely right, and the thrust of the efforts in the programs at the Kennedy School over the last decade and more have been absolutely right in focusing on the nuclear weapon threat as by far the most potentially destructive, and the one that we absolutely have to get right, whatever else we manage to get right and wrong. The difference can be expressed this way. If you think about the dirty bomb threat, a dirty bomb referring to a situation where you have conventional explosives surrounded by radioactive material, so that you use the conventional explosive to disperse the radioactive material. Such a device, even if exploded in an American city, is unlikely to kill immediately very many more people than the explosion itself kills. The radioactive exposure might subsequently kill hundreds over a period of time. The property damage could run into very large numbers, billions and billions of dollars, because of the need to decontaminate the core of an American city. So it would certainly be a big deal, but it would not have remotely the effect in numbers of people killed that a nuclear weapon would. If a nuclear weapon of 10 kilotons, the sort that Graham was describing, were to be exploded in Grand Central Station on a workday, the estimates that have been made by Matt Bunn here and other people elsewhere, and me in various incarnations, suggest that that event would kill 300,000 to 500,000 people outright. It would be 100 times bigger than the 9/11 event in terms of immediate fatalities. That doesn't even count the fallout, the possibility of firestorms ignited and propagating around the city, and so on and so forth. 500,000 people, keep that number in your mind. That's an almost unimaginably bigger catastrophe than 9/11. Dirty bombs don't get remotely into that ballpark. Attacks on nuclear power plants, spent fuel storage facilities, nuclear fuel reprocessing plants are in between. They are harder than a dirty bomb, easier than a nuclear bomb for terrorists to achieve. The fatalities that might ensue if they pulled it off might run from the hundreds to a few thousands in early fatalities as opposed to delayed cancer deaths. Tens of thousands of delayed cancer deaths would be possible from such an event that might be achieved by flying a jumbo airliner into a nuclear power plant at high speed, might be achieved by a knowledgeable and determined group of saboteurs who get inside the power plant and do the things that are necessary to cause it to sustain a meltdown that breaches the containment and lets out a huge radioactive plume. Again, that would be an immense disaster. The property damage would be huge. The loss of life could be very large, even approaching that of 9/11, but it would still be 10 times smaller than a nuclear bomb going off. Sort of the interesting thing is, as you move from nuclear bombs through attacks on nuclear power plants down to dirty bombs, you're moving from huge consequences to really large but not huge consequences to modest consequences in terms of immediate loss of life, but it gets easier. That is, a dirty bomb is a lot easier to pull off than a nuclear weapon. And so it's more likely that we'll see dirty bomb attacks than that we'll see a nuclear bomb attack. The probability of the nuclear bomb attack is lower because it's harder for terrorists to pull off, but it's not low enough. And Graham's point is, in a way, an old point. When you have the possibility of an event which is immensely catastrophic, even if the probability looks like it's modest, you need to do everything in your power to make the probability smaller, because one of these nuclear weapons going off in a city anywhere in the world will transform the entire landscape of modern life in terms of how we think about what we need to do to protect ourselves. If you think about the civil liberties implications of somebody suspecting that there's a nuclear weapon hidden someplace in New York, it's tremendous. I mean, Graham and the focus of this group have got it right. The biggest, most dangerous of these problems is the nuclear bomb problem.
Okay, now Graham, we've just heard someone's not willing to bet their house. John was talking about even a low probability event times large, but you're saying it's a very high probability event. Now, you were actually involved with Nunn-Lugar. You've been involved with other attempts to do this. I sometimes get the sense reading what you write that actually it's a matter of leadership, that fundamentally if a president really took this very seriously, enormous progress could be made. But I'm not sure that's what I heard from Joe, and I just, so far we've been very pessimistic. And are you also pessimistic but desperately trying to get the word out, or how do I think about this, and what could we really do? I mean, if George Bush or John Kerry really decided they cared about it, what would they do?
I'm optimistic. That's probably has to do with
Why you could be dean as long as you were, yes.
Has to do with biochemistry or whatever. But in any case, I don't think naively optimistic about this. I mean, I think Joe's right that, and the reason why part one says inevitable if we just keep doing what we're doing is that, well, if you're betting on things, generally bet in a straight line, and it would require a lot of hard work. But I think there's enough in the history of success in dealing with problems like this to at least give me some reason for thinking that this is doable. And I think the difference between doing it when a president and an administration say simply, this is going to happen, I'm going to do everything that I can physically, technically do to accomplish this, is a very different story than, as you remember when you were an assistant secretary at HHS, or I certainly remember vividly at the Defense Department. And there's many things an assistant secretary can do that a desk officer can't do. But there's a huge amount of things that an assistant secretary can't do that a secretary can do. And even there's another thing when a president. So let me give just two examples. I was involved in the process with Nunn-Lugar in which, when the Soviet Union disappeared, there were 22,000 nuclear warheads that were left scattered around what were now 15 newly independent countries. So remember, those of you that are new student, here's the evil empire. It's been there for a long time. It's got nuclear weapons everywhere. And then one day, at the end of December 1991, it disappears. And so lots of places emerge as newly independent countries, and there are lots of nuclear weapons there. In the book, I give a quote from Dick Cheney, who was then the Secretary of Defense. And Cheney on Meet the Press in December 91 said, if the Soviet Union succeeds in getting back 99% of these weapons, if Russia, this will be the most amazing achievement imaginable. So that would still leave hundreds of weapons out loose. To the best of our knowledge, nobody knows for sure, but to the best of our knowledge, all those nuclear weapons were rounded up and taken back to Russia. Now, we know for sure we haven't found any anywhere else. How did that happen? That happened by an intense level of American-Russian cooperation, mostly the heavy lifting done by the Russians, but with serious American cooperation, and with presidential, and in this instance, Secretary of Defense leadership at points where it was required. So I think in this instance, I could imagine President Bush or Kerry, if Kerry were elected, saying, I'm simply, the consequences, as John said, for our country of this happening are too much to bear. That would change the face of America as we know it. So I'm going to commit myself to do everything technically feasible on the fastest possible timetable, not to let this happen. Now, I then go in the book through how I think that scenario could play out. But I think if a president were to do that, you would see all sorts of current bureaucratic obstacles and log jams look like they were just, minor speed bumps, which you move over very rapidly. And I think I've certainly seen, and I think anybody that's worked in government has seen instances in which Assistant Secretary Schmo worked for 6 months on an issue which they simply couldn't get resolved, and the secretary, in a 3-minute phone call, has got the matter, finished. And I think what we've not had, we had a little bit of this as an impulse at the beginning of the Clinton administration. Then, for whatever reasons, Clinton was off, with other distractions. Bush has said the words, but never has one had this degree of involvement. But I've argued, since I've tried to make this case to the best of my ability to many friends in the current administration, including Colin Powell, who was Weinberger's military assistant when I was his civilian advisor back in the Reagan administration, or Bob Blackwell, who's our colleague. And I think for whatever reason, this hasn't seized the administration. Partly it has to do with Iraq, but I think if I'm just trying to make a comparison, if President Bush had turned with the focus, determination, stick-to-itiveness, and resources, military and diplomatic and economic, that have been devoted to Iraq to preventing nuclear terrorism, I think this problem would have shrunk down to a small problem by now.
Joe, do you agree with that?
I think that Graham is right that the high level of tension inside the U.S. government has been inadequate. Just take his first no, the one where we've done best, which is recovering or making safer the ex-Soviet nuclear materials. There's some appalling stories of non-Lugar funds that weren't expended, or bureaucratic obstacles about who would pay for insurance or would pay for various commercial dimensions of this, which if they'd been taken seriously right at the top, you could have cut through. And so I think it is true that there has not been that kind of high level of tension that's been needed. Indeed, at one point, the Bush administration cut back on the funding for non-Lugar. But I was also pointing to problems which are international, which is if you take the second and third no, where it's more difficult, because with the first no, the Russians have a common interest with us. They don't want the Chechens to get hold of a nuclear bomb either. And so locking up this stuff is in their interest. On the other hand, the interests of the Iranians and the North Koreans to have a nuclear deterrent against Israel or against us means there's less coincidence of interest there than there is with us and the Russians. So I think Graham's first no, we should get a gold standard for loose nukes. Lock this stuff up like Fort Knox. I think he's absolutely right on that. I actually think the prospects for that are pretty good if you did what he just said, raise it to a very high level. The second and third no are the more difficult ones.
Alex?
I think that the wide agreement would be that the media does have a role in shaping policies and public opinion that then can have an impact on the way politicians view things and what they do. But it's a much slipperier relationship than normally is obvious to people. And that's one reason I think that Graham's book is so very important. The real constituency, from my perspective, for Graham's book are the people who are the decision makers in the media in particular, because they're the ones who are going to make the decision about whether this is a story that, even though it does not have the things that a normal appealing story for the media has, that it is important enough, urgent enough to pursue. I mean, it doesn't have pictures. I'll remind you that the story of Abu Ghraib appeared months before it got anyone's attention because there were no pictures attached to it. Thank God we don't have pictures attached to this one yet. But I think that if there are pictures, that's going to change the equation. John, you were talking about a dirty bomb. If a dirty bomb should go off, the whole media perspective on this story is going to change dramatically. And I think that there are some reasons to think that there's going to be something done about this, in the sense that John Kerry has spoken so strongly about it, and that the American public, according to the most recent polls, is now paying very close attention to what's going on. It's the campaign season, of course, but a recent poll I saw today, 71% of Americans are paying very close attention. These issues are being discussed. Graham's book has, I think, not only gotten the normal kind of coverage, but has been lodged in the minds of people who are decision makers and who are shaping news coverage, especially at the elite media. The elite media, the media being the media that go to people like congressmen and go to public policy shapers themselves, they're the ones who probably are most important. It's not as important that Larry King takes this up as it is that stories in the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times appear.
Isn't, though, the press feeling a little burned on the WMD issues? I mean, it raised the threat and so forth, and there's nothing there.
I think that there is no question that there's a kind of threat fatigue. I mean, especially the kind of, color-coded threat fatigue. But I think, again, and I don't want to, I'm not a paid promotional expert for Graham's book, but I think it was very important that Graham wrote this book, because this book is one that puts it clearly and makes a very persuasive case about how devastating this would be. And you don't really have to sell the idea that nuclear weapons are a danger, or that a nuclear blast in New York City would be catastrophic. Many of you older people in this room will remember Jonathan Schell's Fate of the Earth, the article about that detailed in great detail what would happen if a nuclear bomb dropped on Manhattan. And it was a devastating article, and one that really quickened at the moment the question of nuclear disarmament. But I think that there is clearly an easy sell as to the danger. The hard part is making people believe a hypothetical is something that really is a threat. That's something that the media is not usually very good at. Graham's book makes this something that a focus can sharply look at. And I think that the power of the moment is that right now, John Kerry's campaign seems to be focusing especially on the issue of George Bush's judgment. And this certainly, as far as I'm concerned, the way its book's been framed and the way the issue has been framed, falls under that umbrella very readily.
John, I'd like any of your thoughts, and also, it sounded a little bit like inaction's been part of the problem, but are U.S.'s own policies regarding its own nuclear weapons affecting this discussion?
Let me make a couple of comments. First, I want to add one to the last thrust, and then I'll get to your question about U.S. policies. I do think part of the problem is that most members of the public and many members of the political community really do not understand the reality of this threat. Alex is right that they all understand nuclear weapons are bad things, and that if one went off in New York City, it would be a bad thing. But most people, I think, still do not really believe, and Graham's book goes a long way to try to address that terrorists could do this. They understand that if Russia launched a nuclear bomb against New York, New York would be gone. But they don't believe that terrorists can do it. And they don't believe it in part because what they remember is that it took the United States 3 years and $2 billion of 1940s money to make a nuclear bomb in World War II. And they assume that that means it's much too hard for terrorists ever to master this technology, even 60 years later. The problem with that understanding is that most of the 3 years and the $2 billion of 1940s money in the Manhattan Project went into making the materials, making the plutonium and the highly enriched uranium. If today you can steal those materials or get them intact in a stolen bomb, then you short-circuit that whole elaborate, difficult, expensive, high-technology process, which is making the stuff. And that's what most people don't understand. That's why most people erroneously don't believe that terrorists could do it, because they don't understand that the way the terrorists would do it would short-circuit the great bulk of the difficulties associated with making a nuclear bomb.
I think also, going on to what you're saying, I think one of the real problems in terms of selling this as an urgent issue to the press is that thus far there has been no real, direct, concrete link between a terrorist organization and a nuclear bomb. No nuclear bomb or no enrichment uranium has been caught in someone's shoe coming through customs. I mean, there's been nothing that tangibly says, you know, they really are trying to do this. This is not just some, hypothetical.
But of course, Alex, there has been uranium and plutonium caught leaving the former Soviet Union, intercepted in the trunks of cars in Czechoslovakia, found in a refrigerator of an individual who'd stolen it from a Russian facility. So it's not that there's no sign that this material might walk away, as it were.
No, don't misunderstand me. I mean, we watched the USS Cole get blown up and didn't take terrorism seriously. All I'm saying is that if you find someone in Grand Central Station with nuclear material in his shoe, that seems to be the way the United States mind works. It's not a threat until it happens here. And I'm talking about in terms of the mass. I don't think that it requires that. I think the people who are going to do something about this do not require that much of a demonstration. But what they do require is having it put in their face by the mainstream media and by the elite media regularly. And that's something that I think is now possible.
Okay, I want to...
David, I didn't get to your second question.
You're going to have to get it later, because I want to go to question and answer, and these people have been very patient, so my apologies.
Good.
But you had your chance.
Boy, this new dean is tough.
And you gave a terrific answer to the other part. So I'd like now to open up the microphones. There are microphones in 4 spots here, and let me just remind you of a couple of things. First of all, I'd like you to identify yourself. Second of all, I'd like you to remind you that a question is a short statement that ends with a question mark. So with that, let me just start here.
All right, thank you. My name is Mustafa Kibarol. I'm a research scholar here. And my question is to Graham Allison and Joe Nye. Well, I'm working on nuclear proliferation issues and on Iran for more than a decade, and in my opinion, they are determined to get the bomb. But according to some academic scholars, it is an option for Iran, not rather than being determined. But when you look at Iran's history, irrespective of the regime, they have some sort of great ambitions. So what is your opinion? Are they determined, or it is an option that can be reversed? Thank you.
Very good question. And that's exactly what the folks in Vienna at the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, are struggling with today at the board meeting. I would say that Iran has serious ambitions to acquire nuclear weapons is unambiguously a fact, in my view. So the fact that Mohammed al-Baradei, the head of the IAEA, keeps saying, we haven't yet determined, I think he's doing his job as an international civil servant, but the evidence seems to me to be overwhelming. That's point one. Point two, I would say actually that of the governments involved, if you said which came closest to acting like a rational actor, in a coherent fashion, given its objectives, I would say it's Iran. This may be a theocracy or mulocracy. It's got a strange internal politics. But if I want to predict its behavior, it seems to me to be, given its objectives, to be pursuing their objectives rather coherently. So I think the task for the international community is to incentivize a rational actor to freeze what they now have and to back it down on a step-by-step basis. And the only way I believe that one could persuade them to do that is to come to them with a bundle, a grand bargain, in which you assemble all the carrots and also all the sticks. And the carrots include, as Joe said, supply of fuel for their reactors and trade opportunities and assurance from the US that we won't try to change the regime by force. But I don't think they'll only buy the package of carrots. I think it's got to include sticks, which include a credible military threat to destroy the facilities rather than to allow them to operate. And I've got a little scheme in which it seems to me the Israelis are the appropriate club in that closet.
Okay.
Hi, my name's Harpal Sandhu. I'm a junior at the college. First of all, thanks again to all 5 of you for another great JFK forum. I've been to dozens of them. I was wondering if some of you might speculate on some strategic possibilities for me at the nation-state level. If Iran develops nuclear capabilities, how likely and worrying a proposition is it that there'd be a sort of pan-Middle East nuclearization, like with Saudi Arabia, a wealthy state like that, possibly responding with trying to develop nuclear weapons, and perhaps less likely, but in East Asia, a similar kind of question. If North Korea already has a nuclear deterrent, how likely is it that Japan might want to develop one as well? Thanks.
Joe?
Well, as Graham points out in the book, we should also focus on the good news part of all this, which is John F. Kennedy said when he was president that he expected that there would be 20 or 25 countries with nuclear weapons by the 1970s. In fact, there are 8, or if you include North Korea, 9 today. So we're doing a lot better than we might have been. But which means you can do things about this. The great danger, I think, that many people feel now is that if Iran gets nuclear weapons, it might turn out to be a tipping point. Remember, Pakistan and India had explosions in the 90s, but India developed its bomb in the 70s, Pakistan in the 80s during the Reagan administration. They didn't explode it until the 90s. And they were not members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran and North Korea are members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And if those two cheat and get away with it, the feeling is that this may start the erosion of the treaty, that instead of this generalized restraint, that it'll start to spread. And then the question of what will South Korea do if North Korea goes nuclear? What will Japan do if South Korea goes nuclear? What will Saudi Arabia do if Iran goes nuclear? What will that do with Egypt and so forth? That this could be an unraveling. So there is a very real concern that if we fail in the cases of Iran and North Korea, it could be worse than just failing in a normal or any other case. And that's why Graham's package is such a good. Anything I said earlier was not to dissent from his package or what he should be doing, but as the previous questioner asked, I think it's pretty clear that Iran has the intention of developing nuclear weapons, and it's had it for more than 20 years. And I think it's also pretty clear that it doesn't have to do with the regime. If you had a democratic revolution in Iran tomorrow, I think they would still have the new government with the same intention. So the question is, can you put together a package along the lines that Graham described, which makes it so much in their interest to give this up that they will divert from something they've been trying to do for 2 decades. And what I tried to say earlier is we certainly ought to try, but I wouldn't bet on it.
Right up here.
Hi, I'm Dan Epstein. I'm a PhD student here at the university in the Gov department. And my question is, in order to develop the political will in the US to really do something about this, do we need to change the American political discourse? I think back to the 1950s when we had politicians and candidates giving us specifics about the bomber gap and the missile gap and saying, this is specifically what's wrong, this is what we have to do about it. And it seems like in this campaign we've heard a little bit about checking cargo containers coming into the US, but other than that, it's all just very vague stuff about terror and threat and different colors. Do we need to have more details and specifics coming into the campaigning process in order to develop attention and the political will?
Alex, you want to take that?
I think that the specifics help, but it depends on the situation, really. I mean, I think that the John Kerry campaign is being specific, and the George Bush campaign is not being specific, at least in a general kind of way. But I don't know that it really makes all that much difference on this particular issue, because I don't know that people are afraid, particularly, of this. In this campaign, the issues have been Iraq and the economy when people were being serious, and they have been Vietnam service when they've been spending much of their time. And I think that the problem is not just a matter of the specifics. I don't think it's that simple. I think it's a matter of finding a way to persuade people that this is indeed the issue worthy of the inflated rhetoric that we apply in the media to so many things. I mean, you can look at the coverage of Hurricane Ivan, and you look at the coverage of some of the other hurricanes, and they've all used the same language about the disaster. The pictures on television are the same. The houses are devastated, but how many houses are devastated? It's all begins to blur into a kind of an overload of hyperbole, and that's why it's very difficult to sort of separate out an issue that is really important from many other issues that somebody thinks are important but don't really rise to that kind of level.
Graham or John, you want to also add?
I'll pass on this one.
Yeah, I think that the question of what the electorate now both expects and accepts in terms of political campaigns is, I think, discouraging as a fact. So. I don't quite, I mean, that's kind of a general view, and whether and how, if we were engaged in having more specific discussion and debate between the candidates about what they would specifically do, that would affect the probability of their acting on it thereafter. I'm a little hazy.
Maybe what we need is a movie where we don't get to the terrorists in time.
I'm Alexandra. I'm a second-year MPP student. I'm a little concerned that right now our political capital is, to some extent, spent, and our military capacity to intervene in perhaps preventing nascent nukes is limited, either for political or technical reasons. So I wondered if you imagined any other institutions we could work through to implementing some of these no's, or do you see it strictly as a bilateral negotiation?
I'll give a short version and then turn to John. I think of this as multilateral, in which it requires leadership from some party, and however much one doesn't like American unilateralism, and I think it's often ineffective, if one compares this with the alternative, which is sort of nothing happens in many instances, that's a bit of the dilemma. Now, Joe's written a book which I think actually points in the right direction, in which you can imagine American leadership that mobilizes coalitions, and we've been about that for some significant period of time. But if one were trying to solve the problem of Iran, the U.S. can't do it all by itself. It's got to end up persuading Russia and the EU3, and even in terms of Israel, who would be a coordinated player, that there's a hand here to be played all together. And similarly, with respect to locking down nuclear weapons and nuclear material in Pakistan, we're not going to do that. The Pakistanis have to do that. But what we need is a strategy for helping them understand that their stake in it is the same as ours, in that if a nuclear weapon comes loose in Pakistan, there are plenty of local terrorists, including some who've almost killed President Musharraf twice in the past year, who have an interest in a local target. When I do this lecture to the Russians, which I've been doing for some period of time, I say to them, remember, in the Chechen hands, their target is Moscow. It's not Boston or Chicago. Now, maybe if they get a handful of weapons, they'll sell one to somebody else. And so I'm more interested in Boston than I am in Moscow. But they should be interested in Moscow. And most of those actions have to be done by them. So I think our leadership role is in helping people understand the nature of the threat and in mobilizing a collective effort, because we simply can't do this all by ourselves.
John?
Let me just follow on that by noting that the questioner started with political capital, and I think the political capital of the United States in this domain is low for a lot of reasons, one of which is particularly important here is that we have really failed to notice, it seems, particularly in the current administration, that there is a connection linking U.S. nuclear weapon policies, non-proliferation policy, and the accessibility of nuclear weapons to terrorists. First of all, with respect to proliferation and terrorists, it should be obvious, and a lot of the comments here underline it, that the more countries that have nuclear weapons or the nuclear explosive materials needed to make them, the more opportunities and the more kinds of opportunities there are for terrorists to get them. It's not just that the world is a more dangerous place because more governments have nuclear weapons, although that is true. But it's also true that the more governments and the more inexperienced governments and the more unstable governments have nuclear weapons and nuclear materials, the more the chances that terrorists can get them go up. So what do? The United States, which has by far the strongest conventional forces in the world, retains itself nearly 10,000 nuclear weapons today, refuses to renounce what we call the right to use them first on terms of our choosing, including against other countries that do not possess them, refuses to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and basically waxes enthusiastic about the additional missions we might find for additional refinements in nuclear weapons, smaller ones, bigger ones, bunker busters that might need nuclear testing. And we wonder why we seem to lack moral authority in persuading the rest of the world that they can abstain. This is a prescription for low political capital in the world. And as Joe's comments and Graham's comments have underlined, we need the rest of the world to solve this problem. We cannot do it alone, no matter what we do domestically.
Further reaction?
I agree.
Hi, my name's Sebastian Abbott, and I'm a first-year MPP student. And I have a question for Graham Allison and Joe Nye. And when you contrast the administration's actions in Iraq and North Korea, I was wondering whether you believe the actions in Iraq have done more to convince other nations of the perils of developing nuclear weapons, or have done more to encourage other countries that the best means for deterrence is actually developing nuclear weapons.
Well, I have a view about the problem, and I don't want to be unduly partisan about this, but this is what I said before Iraq, and it's also what I think now. I actually didn't mind the president's rhetoric about the axis of evil. It seemed to me that there's some, axis maybe not exactly precise, but the proposition that North Korea, Iran, and Iraq pose significant threats to American and international well-being seemed to me well-founded. And I like very much President Bush's articulation about what he says is the ultimate nightmare. And his bumper sticker for it, which I use in the book and which I think conceptually is helpful, he says it's the world's most destructive technologies in the hands of the world's most dangerous actors. So the most destructive technology, nukes, dangerous actors, terrorists because they don't have a return address. So that's the danger. Got it. Okay. In the run-up to Iraq, it was often said the worry is that Saddam would have and transfer to terrorists nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction. Again, that's the thing, it seems to me, is the leading edge threat. The problem was that we shot the wrong guy, in effect, from my perspective. North Korea had 2 nuclear weapons, or enough material for 2 nuclear weapons, and in the process when we've been in Iraq since January of 2003 has been reprocessing additional plutonium for 6 more weapons. All the time we've been saying, no crisis, no problem. Indeed, we've been doing this multilateral act, okay, in which we debate about whether we can talk to the North Koreans, and we only talk to them with a group of 6 in the room, as if we were doing them a favor by talking to them. I mean, as opposed to grabbing them by the throat, from my perspective, one-on-one, since we're the people they're worried about, and they're the people I'm worried about. Okay. So I would say if we had gone to North Korea, now some people would say, well, you know, if we did Iraq and it worked very well, it would be a bank shot. I mean, that was Colin Powell suggested at one stage. To which the answer is, wait a minute, these guys are making their way down the track. And we may wake up tomorrow, as we did last week, with some mysterious explosion in North Korea and discover that it's a nuclear weapons test. And then North Korea may say, we're a nuclear weapons state with an arsenal, and we're completing our production line that's going to produce another dozen bombs a year. And we've demonstrated by our behavior that we sell whatever we make to whoever will pay. That's it. We have only 3 cash crops now: missiles, illegal drugs, and counterfeit $100 bills. That's the only thing from which, so now we're getting a 4th crash crop, okay, nuclear weapons, and we'll see for that. And we could say, well, wait a minute, at that stage, if you were to sell nuclear weapons to Al-Qaeda, we'd really be angry. To which the answer is, we're down the road a dozen weapons here. And now I've got a much, much more difficult problem to cope with. So I think if this happens, historians are going to look back and say this is the greatest strategic failure in American foreign policy, the North Korean neglect, which was to some extent a matter of our attention was focused elsewhere.
Graham, do you want to quickly respond to John's very provocative comments about U.S. nuclear policy?
I mostly agree, but I a little bit disagree, and it's complicated. I mean, he said it briefly, and John and I have talked about this, and this is one of the kind of chestnut debates at BCSIA for some time. The reason why North Korea is getting nuclear weapons and why Iran is seeking nuclear weapons, I think, is almost disconnected from the fact that the U.S. has nuclear weapons or is getting a few more weapons or would have a few less weapons. I think their ambitions are understandable in terms of, as John pointed out, if we had no nuclear weapons, we would still be militarily overwhelmingly strong, and they think we threaten them, and we may, because there's lots and lots of differences. So I wouldn't say that, and John didn't say, so let me be sure I'm not misinterpreting.
Thank you for that.
Yes. No, but the normal way this argument goes is people say, if we simply said we're going to reduce our nuclear weapons from 10,000 to 1,000, that Iran or North Korea's ambitions or motivation would change significantly. I think it would have virtually no effect.
But we'd get a lot more help from the rest of the world.
Right. Well, that was going to do part 2.
Dealing with it.
Part 2 is if we're trying to round up a posse, especially of Europeans, but also in a regional context, in the Asian context, the question of our political credibility and our moral authority in dealing with it is relevant, and I think changes in our own behavior affect that. So Mohammed al-Baradei has a great line in which he says, Americans are like the fellow who's preaching against smoking as he's got a cigarette, hanging from his lip. I think there's for those of us who've worked for the U.S. government, we are accustomed to saying things that we, on occasion, and in official responsibility, which we know are not true, or which we think may not be true. But I always have said, it's got to pass the test that you can say it without smiling, and I can't quite get out the smirk element in that, so I think John has a strong argument.
Okay, we're running out of time, so very quick questions and quick answers. Yes?
My name is Meredith Fassett. I'm an MPP2. It seems to me there are two components to preventing nuclear terrorism. One, addressing the nuclear component, which the panelists talked about, and two, addressing terrorism. And I wondered if you had a similar three-pronged policy prescription to actually address terrorism in addition.
The short answer is how to solve terrorism. Okay, so the question.
The question was short.
Yeah, the question was short.
I think I have a short answer. No. No, it's a very good question, and actually it's one of the major topics that we try to work on at BCSIA. But I think as the 9/11 Commission report says rightly, that as a country, we don't have a coherent strategy for fighting terrorism. And I would even go further. I can't read somewhere a coherent strategy for fighting terrorism because I don't know who's written it. So it's a great opportunity for, people. It's a great problem for working on.
Janai?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and just to make you sleep less well tonight.
Yeah, so far it's been
in
just really calm.
94, imagine that everything in Graham's book was implemented. In 94, we did a special national intelligence estimate, which we were looking at nuclear terrorism, and we suddenly came to the conclusion that biological might be just as bad and much easier. So even if you solve what Graham has in the book on nuclear, you have extraordinary problems coming up on biological, which drives it back to your point that you've got to do something about delegitimizing terrorism. In other words, as long as technology is putting in the hands of pathological individuals and groups, not just Islamic extremists, but Aum Shinrikyo in Japan or Timothy McVeigh in the US, capabilities to kill at this level, you've got to do something about addressing the terrorism part of the, not just nuclear terrorism, but biological terrorism equation. So your question is extremely on target, and I'm afraid we really don't have yet very good answers.
Subject for another term. Last two questions here and here.
Hi, my name is Yahweh Ye. I'm a first-year MPP student here. Just to piggyback on that question, actually, I just was wondering, some of you have alluded to the Cold War in your comments tonight, and I was wondering specifically what relevant lessons you would draw from the Cold War to apply to the current nuclear environment. And also, just, I think part of me is hoping that the panel tonight would coin a phrase like mutually assured destruction to help the public understand just this new nuclear environment.
Short answer, I would say that for most of our professional lives, for Joe and me and John, the worry was not a nuclear bomb going off in Boston. It was a lot of nuclear weapons going off in many, many American cities, basically causing the whole US to disappear. So I spent many years of my life working on that problem and thinking about the possibility that there could actually be a full-scale nuclear war, after which there would be no people living in the US, none at all. And even in the extreme form, you might succeed in killing the whole species. Now, we lived through that, a lot of harrowing moments, but I believe that by very good strategy, including the unwillingness to allow anybody to have overwhelming force that could pose a credible threat to attack us or to coerce us, as well as a robust political strategy, or what Joe would call the soft power side, in undermining a communist adversary over 40 years, stuck with the strategy, worked it very hard, and at the end of the day, this horrible nuclear war that we worried about didn't happen. So it seems to me the lesson of the Cold War is that it's possible by the composing of a coherent strategy and long sustained work. I mean, actually, $2 trillion went into the Cold War and 4 decades, but nonetheless, that sort of nuclear Armageddon, which I worried about as a real concern when I was a student your age, is now mercifully receded, not to zero, but nonetheless, to the sidelines.
Of course, a slightly more pessimistic view of the matter might reach the conclusion that you have to think very carefully about what additional problems the aftermath will get you into, because in a sense, the problem we're talking about here is the aftermath of the Cold War, both in the physical residue of these nuclear arsenals and the nuclear materials and the knowledge of how to make them, And a further residue of it is the fact that we concentrated those whole 40 years on how to deal with a narrow subset of the kinds of problems that can afflict us in terms of who wants to harm us and how they might go about it.
But compared to the alternatives,
Indeed.
Last question.
Tom Wright, research fellow at the Belfer Centre. I would like to ask the panel to speak to the strategic and political consequences of a nuclear terrorist event if it were actually to occur. And should we be thinking of ways to try to manage those consequences if, as Professor Addison says, the probability is quite high of it occurring?
I'll try to be very brief with this. In fact, I'm glad you asked. Let me see if we can do it. Can you put up one slide? In the book, I offer you the opportunity. We put up a website called nuclearterrorism.org. You can put in your zip code of choice and see what a 10 kiloton explosion would look like. This is in downtown Boston, and you can see in the red zone there, that's about a third of a mile from ground zero. This is a small nuclear bomb, the one that Dragonfire thought was in New York City. Everything disappears. In the second zone, out to almost a mile, things look like the federal office building in Oklahoma City. And in the third zone, you get raging fires. And if Boston, you can see, here in Cambridge, we would know a big event occurred. But so here's Harvard Square. And this would be bad for the buildings at the Kennedy School.
Alex, you want to?
Well, I don't think there's any question that if there should be, I don't think it would take an explosion, as I said. I think it would take a demonstration that this is a reality in a way that has not yet happened on American soil. Catching a terrorist with a dirty bomb, catching someone who was identified as a terrorist in the act of trying to smuggle nuclear material into the country. Something like that would probably have an enormous galvanizing effect. A bomb itself, I think, would be, on the one hand, something that would raise consciousness in a split second, but would also lead to all the kinds of civil liberties issues that are, one of the great unfortunate fallouts of 9/11. To give you one example, one of the reasons that doing journalism on this subject is difficult is because the government is classifying so many more documents now and declassifying so few. This compared to 2001 to 2003, 61% more documents were classified secret in 2003 than in 2001. And in 2001, about 100 million documents were declassified, and less than half that number were declassified in 2003. I think that if there was a nuclear bomb in a major city or a nuclear attack in some other kind of way, the reaction in terms of civil liberties would be extreme because the fear would be extreme, and that might be good for calling attention to this issue, but it would be a tragic way to do it.
Joe?
Yeah, I think you obviously, if something like that were to happen, and if I remember the first part of the book, Graham thinks it's pretty close to 50% probability over 10 years, or within 10 years. So that's a pretty significant probability. One thing is obviously the consequence management in the physical sense, responding to Graham's diagram. The other is the consequence management politically. What are you going to do internationally? Alex mentioned what do you do domestically to prevent us from falling into a McCarthyite type of reaction in which we do the damage to ourselves. I would focus on the question of how can you then galvanize actions internationally in that circumstance to deal seriously with the issues that Graham has raised. And as far as I know, nobody is doing that planning, but maybe that's a good job for the Belfer Center.
John, I rudely interrupted you before, so I want to give you a last word. Also, I want you to at least plug that report that's also
Yeah, I guess the last word would be that in this conversation, we have barely scratched the surface of the content of this subject matter, and I hope that people in the audience who are interested in pursuing it will read Graham's book, but will also go beyond it to the rest of the iceberg to which he referred. I want to mention one report in particular, Securing the Bomb, an Agenda for Action, by Matthew Bunn and Anthony Wire of the Managing the Atom Project in the Belfer Center, which goes into great detail as to what the obstacles are in the way of moving forward with a program of the sort that Graham describes in his book that could really drastically reduce the probability of this terrorist nuclear attack ever happening. There's a website connected with the Managing the Atom Project where this book and a great many other documents can be found. But there's a lot to this issue. There's a lot more that could be done, and I recommend that people dig into this material that's available, the book and the rest of the iceberg, and become more active in getting others to pay attention to it.
I think that's a terrific final word. The book is Nuclear Terrorism, the Ultimate Preventable Catastrophe, as well as many others. Thank you all very much for your time, and thank you to the panel.
What, the Delaware? I was like, why are you going to Peabody? Oh, the Peabody?